Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Adiemo. The headlines. Chinese leader Xi Jinping leaves Russia and heads home, bringing to an end a three-day state visit with President Vladimir Putin. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida meets Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky in a rare visit to Kiev, announces further support. Plus, sounds of explosions heard in Zhankor in the north of the Crimean Peninsula. We begin with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who has now left Russia and is heading back home. It brings an end to a three-day state visit in which the Chinese leader and the Russian President Vladimir Putin pledged to deepen ties in a show of unity that has heightened concerns Beijing will provide cover for the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. Earlier, the Chinese leader had said at a joint press conference with his Russian counterpart that China has always actively encouraged peace talks to resolve the Ukrainian crisis. The press conference took place after the two presidents held extensive talks and signed and released a joint statement which stressed the need to settle the Ukraine issue through dialogue and peace talks. Vladimir Putin said China's peace plan for Ukraine could be used as a basis to end the war, but Mr. Putin said the plan could only be put forward when they are ready in the West and in Kiev. That's a quote. And still on that meeting, Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin had exchanges on bilateral ties and regional and international issues of mutual interest, with the two sides reaching important new understandings in many fields. They both agreed to follow the principles of good neighborliness, friendship, and win-win cooperation in advancing exchanges and cooperation in various fields and deepening the comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for the new era. Noting that China and Russia are each other's largest neighbor, Mr. Xi said to consolidate and develop long-term good neighborly and friendly relations with Russia conforms to historical logic and is China's strategic choice, which will not be affected by any turn of events. Since making his first state visit to Russia 10 years ago, Mr. Xi said China and Russia have respected, trusted, and benefited each other, and the relationship between the two countries has stood firm with time, presenting more comprehensive, more practical, and more strategic features. Meanwhile, the White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby says China's role in the Russian invasion of Ukraine isn't impartial in any way. Mr. Kirby spoke on China's President Xi Jinping's recent visit to Moscow and said that if China wants to play a constructive role in Ukraine, he should urge Russia to end the invasion today. Kirby also said the U.S. and President Joe Biden will keep the lines of communication open with China despite the visit, and added the U.S. government will pursue talks with Mr. Xi at the appropriate time. Mr. Xi and Russian President Vladimir Putin emerged from 2 days of talks on Tuesday with warm words of friendship between China and Russia and joint criticism of the West, but no sign of a diplomatic breakthrough over Ukraine.
Of the UN. I would note that the two sides just said, quote, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter must be observed and international law must be respected. Well, we agree. Following the UN Charter would mean that Russia should withdraw from all the territory inside Ukraine, the territory of another member state of the UN. So now if China wants to play a constructive role here in this conflict, then they ought to press Russia to pull its troops out of Ukraine and Ukrainian sovereign territory. They should urge President Putin to cease bombing cities, hospitals, and schools, to stop the war crimes and the atrocities, and end the war today. I think you've seen over years now these two countries growing closer together. Peter asked a question similar to that yesterday. I wouldn't go so far to call it an alliance. Yesterday I called it a marriage of convenience, because that's what I think it is. These are two countries that are growing closer together, that see in each other useful purposes for pushing back, as I said yesterday, for chafing and bristling at a rules-based order around the world. They want to change the rules of that game. In fact, they would love nothing better, both countries, to see the rest of the world play by their rules. We have seen that through some Chinese companies, there may have been dual-use items that have gone, but we haven't seen any confirmation or indication that the Chinese have provided lethal weapons, lethal capabilities to the Russian Ministry of Defense throughout this conflict. They have not done that. The president wants to keep the lines of communication open with China. Nothing's changed about that. And as I said yesterday, at the appropriate time, we'll pursue another conversation with President Xi. Coming out of what we've seen today, we haven't seen anything that they've said, they put forward, that gives us hope that this war is going to end anytime soon.
White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby. And British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has blamed inflation on the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The British Finance Minister, Jeremy Hunt, had presented the government's budget in an hour-long speech to Parliament last week. He sought to revitalize Britain's stagnating economy with a mix of childcare and pension reforms to tempt people back to work, as well as corporate tax breaks to boost weak business investment.
But if you think about, why are we in that situation? It's really because we've experienced two, I don't want to say once in a generation, once in a century type shocks in the space of a couple of years, as you said. First of those was obviously COVID, pandemic, where we shut down the country and the economy, and then it reopened around the world with all the challenges that put on inflation and supply chains. And then the next shock was obviously the war in Russia and Ukraine, Russia's illegal invasion, which has caused an enormous spike in energy prices. And when you put those two things together, that's the main reason we're seeing the challenges on inflation that we are. But because it's inflation that is causing the problem. It's inflation that is driving up food bills, energy bills, the bills of everything. And I want to bring inflation down. The situation now is that because of the war, because of the pandemic, inflation is far too high. That's why my #1 priority is to halve inflation. That's why the budget set out support for people, freezing fuel duty, helping them with their energy bills, extending free childcare. Those are all things that are going to make a difference to people's lives.
Still facing the sharpest drop in living standards since the
waiting list. At this point, think about it. I'm sure almost every person watching this has in their extended circle of friends and family someone who is waiting for treatment. And the reason for that is because we had a pandemic, and whilst the NHS was dealing with that, people were not seeing their GP, hospitals were not able to do the normal business they do, and that's why we've got waiting lists, why everyone watching will know somebody that's waiting for one. I don't think that's right. And again, at the beginning of the year, I set out my priorities. One of them was to cut NHS waiting lists. And in order for us to accomplish that, we need our best doctors, our experienced doctors, we need them working. And they want to work. They want to help get the waiting list down. They want to work longer hours. They don't want to retire. And because of the pension regime, they were stopped from doing that. It was preventing them from doing that. And I want to get the waiting list down, and that's why we've made the change that we've made. It's not fair on people who are actually trying to come here legally. It's not fair for those who are being exploited by criminal gangs, some of whom actually tragically lose their lives. It's not fair because we can't target our compassion on the people who most need it, and it's not fair on all the people watching, the hard-working British public, who are currently paying £5.5 million a day to house illegal asylum seekers in hotels. Now, none of that is right, and we've got to stop that. Make it clear that if you come to this country illegally, you won't be able to stay, you'll be detained, and you'll be swiftly removed, either to your home, if it's safe, or to a safe alternative like Rwanda. The policy, as we said at the time, is being challenged, and we said that we would defend it in the courts. That's what we're doing. The good news is we've had one court judgment already, which said the government was absolutely in the right. But there's further legal proceedings that are going on. We have to go through those. We will continue to defend our case. And it's only until those court proceedings are finished, and I'm not the one who sets the dates for those. And when those court proceedings are finished, and we hope to be successful, as we have been so far, then we'll be able to start flights to Rwanda. And we've got some big things to do. As we talk about halving inflation, growing the economy, reducing debt, cutting waiting lists, stopping the boats. Yeah. Those are big things. Those are the 5 promises I made to the country, and I'm working night and day to deliver on those.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak talking about Britain and its economy and how all of that relates to the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Pentagon says it plans to speed up the delivery of Abrams tanks to Ukraine, providing the vital equipment to Kiev as soon as this fall. In January, the Biden administration pledged to supply Ukraine with 31 advanced M1A2 Abrams tanks after months of shunning the idea of deploying the difficult-to-maintain tanks to Ukraine. The new plan would give Ukraine the M1A1 Abrams tanks variant, which can run on diesel fuel like the majority of the Ukrainian fleet.
In close coordination with Ukraine, has made the decision to provide the M1A1 variant of the Abrams tank, which will enable us to significantly expedite delivery timelines and deliver this important capability to Ukraine by the fall of this year. It will also give Ukraine a very similar capability to the M1A2, which includes advanced armor and weapon systems to include a 120mm cannon and 50 caliber heavy machine gun. So we never got into the specifics other than to say we were projecting it would be probably over a year or so before we would have been able to deliver that A2 variant. And so, again, this approach will allow us to get that combat capability then quicker. So my understanding, Tony, is that these will be excess hulls in our inventory that we will refurbish, refit through a combination of USAI and security assistance packages in order to make them combat ready. So really, to put that into context, what we were talking about at the time was whether or not we had M1A1s that were going to roll off, or M1s in general are going to roll off the line, ready to go forward. So we're talking about a different thing here, right? We're talking about refitting, refurbishing these hulls to make them ready on a quicker timeline.
Let's talk now to Victoria Siredia, Senior Fellow at the Forum of Trans-Regional Studies, who joins us virtually from Berlin in Germany. Good morning to you, Victoria. Nice to see you once again.
Morning.
This issue of knowing whether or not how quickly equipment is going to be sent to Ukraine continues to be fairly mixed. On one hand, you have some of the countries that pledged equipment that they will be sending them, not so quickly because it takes time to prepare them. But then you have others, like the U.S. just did, saying that they can and will modify existing equipment so that Ukraine can get them much faster. How much do you think Ukraine needs this in terms of speed?
Ukraine needs as soon as possible if people who are following the situation over recent days can see that actually beginning from mid-February, Russia launched intensive attack on several cities of Ukraine, and Ukraine is desperately needed not only manpower but the guns to counter attack. And also we just today in Ukrainian news we saw another warning from the US military that actually we are to expect a second wave of intensive Russian attacks from very different directions in the nearest days or in the nearest months.
Now, China and Russia have been meeting over the last 2 or so days. The Chinese president rarely has gone to Moscow, but this time he's gone to Moscow to meet with President Putin. And one of the things he took along with him was a peace plan, which has been discussed extensively at that summit and then has been presented to other stakeholders. But do you think there are any elements in that peace plan that could appeal to Ukraine?
So we also had a reaction from UN, from different officials, European officials, and from Ukrainian president on this proposed peace deal. And just yesterday, Volodymyr Zelensky said that he's open to a dialogue with China and he's open to any peace negotiations. But of course, the issue is that this proposal is extremely vague. It calls for the ceasefire, but it doesn't say what are the conditions, and specifically what is extremely important for Ukraine, that it needs to state that Russia will withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territories. And this point is missing from the version China was presenting around the world.
Let me ask you, do you think perhaps because that has not happened yet, the Chinese president has met with the Russian president, but he hasn't met with the Ukrainian president yet. Do you think there's any value that can be brought to any kind of peace deal if the two of them met?
I haven't heard of any possibilities or any plans for them to meet. I know that Chinese president was planning to call to Zelensky after he'll finish his visit to Russia. So possibly they will discuss what was discussed during their meeting in Kremlin. But as I said, this is extremely important to have certain basis for peace talks, and Zelensky said that he's welcoming any initiatives, similarly as he welcomed any initiatives proposed by, for example, Turkish president. But the question is, what are the terms of these negotiations and how sustainable proposed peace negotiations can be? Because if we are talking only about the ceasefire, which will allow Russia to save time for preparing for another attacks on Ukraine without withdrawal its troops from its territories, then this is not a stable peace negotiation. It's just a temporary decision which will not lead to the resolving of the conflict, but just will prolong it and make it even more protracted.
There seems to be battle fatigue on all sides now. This has gone on for much longer than anybody expected at the beginning, and there are those that I've spoken to who have said that Russia, Ukraine, the supporters of either side are all looking for a way out of this, and that, you know, discussions for peace should now be brought forward. You referenced the proposals made by the Turkish President Erdogan. Have those been dropped completely? Nobody seems to be talking about those anymore.
I think what we just observed exactly this week as well, that there were no peace negotiations proposed by the President Erdogan, but what he managed actually to negotiate prolongation of the grain deal. And this was the only platform on which some agreements were reached between Russia and Ukraine, taking the situation with the food shortages in Africa and Asia. So Erdogan is active, but he's active in some other fields currently, but we should not forget that they are heading towards elections in Turkey. So right now, probably he's more busy with his political situation, and also because of the consequences of the earthquake.
Indeed, that was a really tragic incident that happened to Turkey. But then even the grain deal that you mentioned, there is contention over the grain deal, because while Ukraine talks and the UN talks and Turkey talks about the fact that the terms of the renewal of the Ukraine deal talk about 120 days, the Russians are insisting that what they agreed to is only 60 days. And that's what they're sticking to, that the renewal is only for 60 days. Why is there this differential, shall we say, in the terms of even the grain deal, which, as you said, was to help ensure that grain is delivered to those who need it the most?
since we see how Russia is using its power to press different issues globally, again to make a coalition of countries which will press Western coalition and Ukraine for negotiation over the peace. And Russia uses very different means, including grain deal. Ukrainian vessels, there are very many Ukrainian vessels just waiting for a possibility, already loaded, waiting for possibility to deliver this grain where it's needed, but it constantly stopped by the Russian side.
Now, in that kind of situation, what do you think we should be able to see going forward? You referenced the Chinese plan earlier, and one of the elements which you said was it talks about a ceasefire, but that the other elements of it are quite vague. You don't know the terms of the ceasefire and so on. But perhaps a dialogue could put that out, ceasefire, then talk. Usually that's how dialogues happen, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. But what we are observing exactly yesterday, both presidents, in the time when they were meeting and talking that they are peace brokers and they propose Ukraine peace talks, and that then Ukraine and its Western allies should just say yes. Simultaneously, at this moment, Russia was actually firing new missiles and drones over Ukraine. And today in the morning, we have a second wave. So while we are talking, there is a new air raid in Ukraine, and we are expecting a new wave of drones falling to the cities. So you cannot pretend that you are for the ceasefire, that you propose a peace talks, and exactly at the same time kill civilians and hit civilian infrastructure in Ukrainian cities.
Before I let you go, I must ask you just in a minute or two to give us an idea of what the situation is on ground in Ukraine. You talked about air raid sirens, which means that another attack or another set of attacks are imminent even as we speak. But what has been the situation on ground in the last couple of days?
So there were already a wave of attacks before last few days, and this is always happening when something on international arena is happening. And with the announcement of the Criminal Court of Justice that warrants arrest of Putin, Ukraine was hit by a new wave of strikes. And this shows that this is not about military tactics. It's only making people and civilians feel that they would suffer even further if any steps are taken to either taken further, and if they are not going along the Russian rules and starting peace negotiations again on the proposed rules of Russia.
Victoria Seredia, Senior Fellow, Forum of Transregional Studies in Berlin. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Do continue to stay safe.
Thank you.
And after the break, evacuation of elderly and disabled from frontline Chasiv Yar begins in eastern Ukraine as heavy fighting continues. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says 7 of 30 allies met NATO's military spending target of 2% of GDP in 2022, one country less than in 2021 before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, urging the allies to boost defense investment more quickly. Mr. Stoltenberg did not reveal which countries reached the goal, but referred during a news conference in Brussels to NATO's annual reports to be published later on Tuesday. However, I urged allies to boost their military spending more swiftly.
Since 2014, allies have increased defense spending, and we are moving in the right direction. But we're not moving as fast as the dangerous world we live in demands. So while I welcome all the progress that has been made, it is obvious that we need to do more, and we need to do it faster. At our summit in Vilnius in July, I expect allies to agree a more ambitious new defense investment pledge, with 2% of GDP as a minimum to be invested in our defense. In this new and more contested world, we cannot take our security for granted. It is our security that underpins our prosperity and our way of life. In this report, both graphically but also, and it shows that 7 allies now spend 2%. We actually expected that to be slightly more earlier, but because GDP has increased more than expected for a couple of allies, 2 allies that we expected to be at 2% are now slightly below 2%. So first, we haven't seen any proof that China is delivering lethal weapons to Russia. But we have seen some signs that this has been a request from Russia, and that this is an issue that is considered in Beijing or by the Chinese authorities.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has met Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in a rare visit to Kiev that underscores Tokyo's support for Ukraine as it fights Russia's offensive. During his visit, the Japanese Prime Minister visited the Ukrainian town of Bucha, where more than 400 civilians were said to have been killed last year by Russian forces, and has since become synonymous with alleged Russian brutality during the war. Mr. Kishida paid tribute in Kiev city center to fallen Ukrainian soldiers, accompanied by an honor guard. He laid a wreath outside the church before observing a moment of silence and bowing. Meanwhile, his visit is also to deliver a message of solidarity and support for Ukraine. His trip was kept secret until the last minute for security reasons. It is rare for a Japanese leader to make an unannounced visit to another country. Japan, a key ally of the United States, has its own territorial dispute with Moscow that dates back to the end of World War II. Russia's invasion has also deepened concern in Moscow and among Japanese about what would happen to Japan if China were to invade Taiwan. Encouraged by the United States, Japan in December unveiled its biggest military buildup since World War II, with a commitment to double defense spending to 2% of GDP within 5 years. And the Japanese Prime Minister had been the only leader of the group of G7 nations who had not visited Ukraine before now, which has seen an outpouring of popular support in Japan following the Russian invasion more than a year ago. Mr. Zelensky had said at a joint news conference with Mr. Kishida that he would join an upcoming G7 summit in Japan via an online link following an invitation from the Japanese Prime Minister. Japan is due to host the summit in Kishida's hometown of Hiroshima in May. Mr. Zelensky posted footage of him greeting Mr. Kishida, whom the Ukrainian leader called a truly powerful defender of international order and a longtime friend of Ukraine in central Kiev. Mr. Zelensky also suggested Kiev had suggested to China that Beijing join a Ukrainian peace formula to end Russia's war in Ukraine, but that it was still waiting for an answer. Beijing has proposed a 12-point peace proposal, but Kiev insists on a full Russian troop withdrawal and has been promoting its own plan in recent months. President Volodymyr Zelensky says his country's armed forces need more ammunition, most of all, and are expecting an increase in the supply from Western partners. Speaking during his usual nightly address, he also praised a visit by Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida unannounced before that address. Mr. Zelensky said talks with his Japanese counterpart were productive and covered security, political, economic, and humanitarian issues.
I held today the Supreme Commander-in-Chief meeting. Main issue, the front line. Our warriors, our positions, our reinforcement. Commanders were reporting the Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces military reconnaissance. One of the issues which always attracts utmost attention is the supply of ammunition, support from our partners. We're expecting an increase in supply of precisely what we are in need of most right now. Today, our country's guest, Japan's PM Kishida, started his visit to Ukraine by getting to Bucha, by commemorating all whose lives were cut short by Russian terror. Mr. Kishida visited the memorial wall in the Kyiv next to St. Michael's Cathedral. He paid respects to our warriors who fell defending Ukraine, and this is very important. Global leaders are showing courage by visiting Ukraine despite all the risks. They show respect to our people who fight not only for their state and for Ukrainian independence, but also to ensure the world's civilized rules. Civilized way of life would prevail.
Vladimir Zelensky, president of Ukraine. Heavy artillery fire sounded from nearby Ukrainian positions, as well as incoming impacts in the streets of Chasiv Yar west of Bakhmut and the nearby village of Kalniva in eastern Ukraine, as residents evacuated their homes. Between apartment blocks in Chasiv Yar, mainly elderly residents queued for water and food delivered by a team from the State Emergency Service. Officers of that service knocked on doors asking elderly and disabled people in Chasiv Yar and nearby villages to get ready for evacuation from the town, which is about 17 kilometers from the city of Bakhmut. The military administration of the town said the evacuation of children from the town was completed on Sunday. The months-long battle for Bakhmut has become one of the bloodiest of Russia's nearly 13-month war in Ukraine. Let's talk now to Mr. Ladi Adiemo, public policy analyst, who joins us virtually from Lagos. Good morning to you, Mr. Adiemo. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Ladi. Thank you so much for having me.
Vast amounts are now going into defense spending by all those concerned, Ukraine, Russia, the Western allies, Russia, China, Japan, and all, even those who are not directly involved. Do you think there is a risk that all this spending and all this acquisition of weapons could increase the likelihood that we will have a much wider conflict?
The truth of the matter is, and I'm sure we've discussed it sometime in the past, the spending, the investment, the involvement are unavoidable. Whether it affects us directly now or later, we are all involved in this fight. Some of us is because we want grains. Some of us is because we want the supplies that we used to get from Ukraine, for instance, and for whatever is worth, we're not getting the supplies as we usually will get, and we're suffering economically here. So we're involved in that manner. For US, they are the leaders of the opposition, as it were. You know, they are leading the face-off, and at the end of the day, it seems that they need to make sure that their mark is, or their impact is felt. For Europe, they have to protect their territory. They need to come up with all sorts of presents so that Russia will not think of coming to them tomorrow morning. For China, they have a relationship with Russia. They need to let them know that, look, we're still in this together. We're still partners. We're doing this together. For Japan, they also need to show the US that, okay, our involvement is true, and we don't want the situation. We have a problem with Taiwan and all of that. So there are economic reasons, there are security reasons, there are all sorts of reasons. The bottom line is we are all involved in this war.
The United States and the Western allies had tried to ensure that Russia and China do not come closer than they were. This summit that took place Monday and yesterday before President Xi headed off home is testimony, do you think, that they failed in that regard? Russia, they have not been able to keep Russia and China apart.
Again, the problem we have on ground is, and a lot of people have alluded to this, U.S. obviously are not, we can't say they're saints. And the trust and complete respect for them is maybe because of their military power. In the past, they have taken on certain wars. A very good example is the one with Iraq, that 20 years after, we're all questioning their invasion into Iraq. The war at Libya, as Africans, we also have a lot of reasons to say maybe they shouldn't have come. So what I'm saying in a nutshell is China, yes, they are also a superpower, and they probably cannot be cowed into any decision. So yes, the US as leading NATO will say, oh, we don't want you to be involved. We don't want your involvement and all that, because of course they also understand their involvement, because if they become involved, it means that the supplies, the support that Russia needs to continue to, prosecute this war will be guaranteed, because China then can make sure a lot of things happen for them. They probably will not become as, quickly tired as we will expect them to, because at the end of the day, we all need for all of them to be fatigued so that we can all come to the table and completely get out of this quagmire that we all have found ourselves. But China obviously would not allow Russia to become as tired as we want them to become. So the US, like I said, does not have enough moral justification, as it were, because at the end of the day, historically, we all have seen that they also have taken certain decisions that can be queried even 20 years after. So this is why all of these is playing up, in my opinion.
Let's look at the facts, as it were. Now, what has resulted, what President Xi took to Moscow, apart from all the bilateral agreements that were signed with the Russians, was what was described as a peace proposal, which he presented to President Putin. President Putin said, well, yes, we can look at this. This looks like a basis for some kind of a beginning of talks. The Ukrainians have agreed that, yes, indeed, it looks like something that can be looked at. But as the person who spoke on the program, Victoria Sereda, who is a Ukrainian, before now said, the proposal is still quite vague. It doesn't specify the terms of a ceasefire before talks begin and all of that. What do you make of the proposal?
Truth of the matter is, the only win or the only proposal that I believe will be attractive to Ukrainians is for Russia to completely leave their territory, because it's a territorial war. But the truth of the matter is, you and I know, I mean, just last week, Putin was in Mariupol to go sit there and drive around the town to say, oh, this is our space. There's a lot of development and repair that is going on right now as we speak. So I am sure that we all understand that Russia would definitely not completely leave Ukraine, because that's how they annexed Crimea, and today, that has become history. And so I'm sure they're hoping that if not everything, they will be able to annex certain areas, Bakhmut, Mariupol and the rest of them. And of course, Ukraine does not want that. So as much as I want to be optimistic that we need to quickly go to the table and discuss, and so that we all can get out of this quagmire, I'm also very wary that we're not likely to get Putin to want to completely leave, which is what Ukraine will want. So it's a dichotomy, and I just hope and pray that at the end of the day, this will quickly get off the table, so that the rest of the world can go back to our life as we had it before last year.
China is said to be the only country, the Chinese leader is said to be the only leader who could get President Vladimir Putin to do what you just said, which is withdraw from Ukrainian territory, and then any other thing can follow. But he doesn't seem inclined to do that. And many wonder, what exactly is in this for China? I mean, if you limit it to what is going on in Ukraine. There are those who have pointed out to the fact that China has its own ambitions over Taiwan and all of that, and this is like a dress rehearsal. But if you limit it to Ukraine, what possibly could China stand to benefit from siding Russia in Ukraine, strategically or in terms of war booty or whatever it is?
Whenever you go into discussion with a strong partner, you're always very, very careful and sensitive of the things you say or do. Now, it is easier to go in and discuss with someone who you perceive as not too powerful and be able to get all the things you want. So no matter how good, whatever good intention you have, when you're talking to someone, and I'm referring to Russia now, with their strength and their military capacity and capability, you want to be careful and tread cautiously when you're coming up to the table to discuss with them, because you then have a lot of things to lose. You have economic reasons, you have a lot of things, and like you said, China also have their own agenda with Taiwan and all of that, and they don't want to be seen to have opposed to something that they probably have, want to do sometime in the future. So the world, over time, I mean, with my interaction and all the things I've continued to do, I've seen that it's a very complex place. And you're not really going to have a direct answer or a direct conclusion when you're talking about a lot of things. What we will end up having is we all look at things most of the time from how much we're able to benefit from it or how much we're going to lose from it. And whenever we take decision or we make a pronunciation, we're kind of careful what we say so that we don't lose or we gain.
Indeed, Mr. Ladi Adiemo, as always, incisive perspective. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
And when we return, Russians stage peaceful protest against the Ukraine war, receiving hugs from strangers who are against the invasion. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. An explosion has been heard in a town in the north of the Crimean Peninsula in video released earlier. Ukraine's defense ministry says the explosion in Zhankoy destroyed Russian cruise missiles intended for use by Russia's Black Sea Fleet. A Russian-installed official in the peninsula, which was annexed by Moscow in 2014, says the blast was caused by drones laced with shrapnel and explosives and targeted civilian sites. One person was injured. A quick look at the business out of this conflict this morning. Good morning to you, Ini. John McQuarrie joins us. Ini, what exactly is our situation now? Russia's central bank is making it more costly for commercial lenders to have liabilities in what it calls unfriendly countries. This unfriendly is becoming very important, where you get.
It is very, very important. As we know, they're trying to ensure that they mop up as much as possible the dollar, the euro, the pounds from their economy. So they have increased their CRR, that's their cash reserve ratio. So what that means is banks are now, it used to be 7%, they moved it to 7.5%. So banks are now compelled to reserve 7.5% of whatever amount of value they have of this dollar, euro, and bond to keep it with the Russian Central Bank, yes, before they can do any other business with it. So, so the interesting thing comes because it used to be 7%, they raised it to 7.5%. Meanwhile, for the friendly countries, it used to be 7%, everything used to be 7%, but for the friendly countries, it's now 5.5%.
So it's good to be in the friendly bracket.
For the ruble, it's now 4%. In essence, it's easy, banks. It's easy for you to do business or lend in rubles because you don't need to keep so much.
Right.
And for the friendly countries too, I mean, it's fairly better, 5.5%.
One would give a lot to be in the friendly bracket. President Putin and President Xi, amongst all the other things, really big deal.
Very, very big deal.
This Siberia 2 gas pipeline to China. How important is it? Very
important because, I mean, Europe is winning itself off Russian gas. Russia has been flaring its gas, wasting it for nothing. So now they have this deal that they want to do with China. They want to start connecting Siberia through Monrovia to the northwestern part of China. So it will be a direct gas supply there. I think they want to do about 50 million cubic per year,
right?
You know, starting from I think a couple of weeks or a couple of months or something like that. So Russia will have new revenue. Russia will have less waste.
And China will have more guaranteed supply because the distance isn't that much.
Yes.
But just before we go, a quick look at Ukraine securing $15.6 billion IMF loan.
Yes. So
business still has to be done, even if it is war.
Exactly. And IMF, I mean, it's a risk, but they are saying that they're hoping that some parts of Ukraine will start functioning in a couple of months. They are hoping that this will help build some infrastructure and help at least parts of the economy, you know, to start working. And they had to compromise, kind of. They now have a new condition to reduce some of the requirement from countries for Ukraine to be able to access this because, of course, it's a loan. It might be a small digit interest, but it's still a loan.
It's still a loan, which it has to get paid back.
It has to get paid
with
back.
Whatever that small interest is.
Yes, you know, so, I mean, IMF had to go through a long lens to be able to get this. They've not given it to them. They've just had a staff management agreement. They've done assessments and all of that. So it's almost sure, you know, but even that they will get it. But, I mean, you still have to ask yourself, for how long will Ukraine be getting these loans and how are they going to pay it back? So at the end of the day, we don't get, you know, that rating that Ghana got some time ago.
Yes. That's been a cautionary tale for everybody.
For everyone.
Thank you very much. More, of course, on this and all the other business stories of the day follows this program on Business Morning and later on Business Incorporated. Finally on the program, for 20-year-old Russian Nikita Gorbanov, receiving hugs from strangers could lead to a prison sentence, a price he is willing to pay to provide hope as the war in Ukraine rages on. Mr. Gorbanov took to the streets of Izhev, standing in a square, holding a sign that read, "Hug me if you're against the war." In the hour and 8 minutes he stood in the square, around 50 people came up and hugged him. Russian police officers eventually arrested him and took him to the police station, where he was later released and is unsure of what the consequences he will face beyond a fine of 30,000 rubles would be. Thanks for being with us. That's our program this morning. My name is Ladi Adiemo. Have a pleasant day ahead. Good morning.